Yeah, so this is the final evening of our Death, Karma and Wisdom seminar. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to sort of attempt to talk about everything that we've talked about, because we have said quite a lot over the last sort of 8 weeks. One thing I would say is I'd recommend that if you're interested in the subject area, have a look at our YouTube channel, because all the talks from the second half of the evenings are up there. And I found it very, very enriching, co-leading, but also being at the evenings as well. I think in a sense, what we've talked about through talking about death, karma and wisdom is really sort of the heart and the essence of, not just Buddhism, but what it is to live a truly sort of meaningful human life. And what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll sit, and then we'll do a short exercise in pairs, and then we'll finish the evening. But I'm just going to draw out a couple of themes and explore them in my own way to finish. So before I kind of get into the main body of what I want to say, I want to talk about a dream that I had this morning. So it's a slightly bizarre dream. I don't know how much to explain it, but I'll just say what it was, basically. So I've been talking about dreams quite a lot over the last 8 weeks. In fact, on the first week, I was talking about a very significant dream that I had about my father. Significant for me, and this seminar has been quite significant for me because it's on the subject of death. And, this month, in a few weeks' time, actually, is the 20th anniversary of my father's death. So he died almost 20 years ago to the day. And I've been thinking about him a lot and recollecting thoughts of him. And I'm going to do a short solitary retreat in a couple of weeks' time around the anniversary of his death to sort of pay honour to him, really. And I talked about a dream that I had about him in the first week. But this dream wasn't about him. This was a dream about cakes. Kuslasara's got a theory that when Buddhists talk about cake, they're actually talking about sex. But I can tell you it's not about sex. It's about cakes. It's about cakes. But in this dream, it was quite weird. So what happened was, I was on a retreat. So David Mitra has been urging you to go on retreat. Very good thing to do. I was on a retreat. And somehow I was on this retreat, and it was a week-long retreat, but I decided in advance that I was only going to go for the weekend. So I thought, okay, I know it's a week-long retreat, but I'm only going to go for the weekend. And the reason was, it was a bit weird. It was kind of one of these dream logic things. I thought it's not a very good retreat because it's too scientific and too mathematic for me. Slightly odd, but that's sort of dream logic. Make of that what you will. But anyway, I decided I was only going to go on this retreat for the weekend. And then I was on the retreat, and suddenly I noticed that there were all these cakes. And they were really amazing cakes. Like somehow, again, dream logic, in my mind, I knew that they were cakes from Vienna. So they were these really special cakes with like sort of chocolate logs and cream and cherries and things like that. And I thought, I didn't realise there were going to be these kind of cakes on the retreat. Maybe I'll stay for the whole week. So I decided that I was going to stay for the whole week. And I decided that I was going to stay for the whole week. And when I decided that, the dream had been in black and white. And when I decided that, the dream started to become colour. So it became colour. Everything was much more animated. And I started thinking to myself, well, why didn't I just think of that anyway? Why didn't I think about staying for the whole thing? I can't believe I was just going to come for the weekend. And there's these cakes. So I'm going to say a bit more about that. It has a very definite meaning, which I'll need to sort of translate for you. And I'll say a bit more about what that is in a moment. But I wanted to start with that. So there's that dream and cakes. So we've been talking about these three words: death, karma, and wisdom. And the thing that I want to draw out about death is, well, the most important thing is that we have an effect. So we've talked about this a little bit in the last few weeks, and this feeds into karma as well. But the most important thing I want to say is that the fact of death means, well, our life is finite, but that doesn't mean that it's meaningless. In fact, quite the opposite. I think when we start to come into relationship with the fact that our life is finite, what we realize is that we have this precious opportunity. So it's an opportunity which is limited by time. We don't know how limited by time it is. We all sort of have this idea, don't we? We have this unconscious assumption that we're going to live for a long time. And I think we have ideas about, my grandmother lived to be 100, for example. So, we'll have this long life, and then probably we'll have a fairly dignified death and so on. But we can't take that for granted. We can't take that for granted at all. So I was just talking about my father, and one of the things that's quite poignant for me about him is that he died when he was just a few years older than me. So he died when he was 49. I'm now 44. So if I died at the same age as him, I would just have a few years left. Now, obviously, that's quite young to die, but it happens. People die at any age, don't they? But in reflecting on his passing and in reflecting on his life and my relationship with him, what I've realized more and more is actually how we tend to underestimate the effect that we have. So in the way that we choose to live our lives, we have an effect. So we have an effect primarily on ourselves. So we can change ourselves. We can colour our own lives and the lives of others. And we can continually shape and change ourselves. So we can make of ourselves, I wouldn't say whatever we want, but we have a tremendous amount of agency in terms of who we choose to become and what we make of ourselves. So I was thinking about this in relation to my dad. Just been thinking about him a lot, really. And then also I've been thinking about this in relation to a friend of mine who, I know there are a few of you here that were on the spring retreat. And I was talking about this friend at length on the final day of the spring retreat. And it's quite interesting sitting here. Whenever I sit here and teach, I'm always aware that there is this object behind me. So for those of you who can't see, there's a stupa behind me. There are actually three. And the one in the middle, with the very sort of bright colours and everything on it, that contains the ashes of a very good friend of mine. So this friend of mine, Vidya Jyoti. So she was a very dear friend of mine, and she died about 10 years or so ago, I think. So she was in her early 70s when she died. And in the final years of her life, she had a tremendous effect on me. And she had a tremendous effect on a lot of people, actually. So she was quite a remarkable woman in lots of ways. And I've never really met anyone else quite like her in my life, and that continues to this day. So one of the things that I've really loved about her was how incredibly direct she was. So I remember once walking out of this shrine room with her, and somebody had, it was a festival day, so it was a big, the shrine room was full, there was lots of people, and somebody gave a talk. And it wasn't the best talk I've ever heard in my life, but generally you try and be polite and respectful about these sorts of things. And I remember walking out of this room with her, and her putting her arm through mine, and she looked up at me and she said, "Gosh, what a boring talk." She's just basically so direct, would never sort of mince her words. And in that way, she was quite a challenge to be around. Some of the suggestions she gave me about how I should live my life were also very direct. And Yeah, I could just sit here and tell anecdotes about her all night, but I won't do that. But she was a really, really remarkable woman, and very, very, very much loved in our community. So people really, really loved her. And seeing her through the end of her life and being with her when she got ill and seeing kind of how she was, how kind she was to me, how encouraging she was of me. One of the things that I really regret is that she is somebody who very much encouraged me to take my Buddhist practice seriously. She was very, very, very encouraging of me taking things seriously, of me committing. Really encouraged me to ask for ordination, and said that one day she'd like to see me in the Triratna Buddhist order. And one of my regrets is that she never got to see that, because she died before I was ordained. But at the end of her life, she was diagnosed with cancer, basically, and I spent a lot of time with her. And then I was with her when she died. And that's the first time I've been with a human being when they've died. And it was a very, very powerful experience. And then her funeral was also extremely powerful. Seeing somebody's life really fully honoured, and seeing this shrine room absolutely packed with people. Everybody just very, very deeply appreciative and loving of her and what her life was. The final thing that happened in her funeral was that my friend Vanda Najoti, who some of you will know, and two of her friends sang this song, which was called Vanda Najoti, and it was to the tune of Dancing Queen by ABBA. And they'd sang it at her 70th, and it was basically all about her life when she was young. So the only line I can remember was, back in Brooklyn in '38, life at home wasn't always great. And it carried on like that. Anyway, it's this song about her to the tune of Dancing Queen. It's very, very beautiful. And I think what I'm trying to say is we often underappreciate actually the effect that we have on other people and the effect that we can have on other people. So because we tend to look at the world through our own consciousness, we tend to just think, oh, well, it's just me. I'm not particularly important, or I can't have much of an influence. You can, and you do, and actually everything we do and say and think has an effect. And everything we do and say and think has an effect on ourselves, and it has an effect on other people. So I think when we really sit and think about it, it's a self-evident truth, isn't it, that other people have a strong effect on us. If we just think about our parents, or we think about our friends, or whoever it is. And if we stay with that self-evident truth, then by extension, we need to be much more aware of actually how we're conducting our lives, because we have this tremendous opportunity, to create joy in the world, to create more openness, to create more love in the world, to reduce and lessen our own suffering, or even to end it, and to end the suffering of other people as well. So there's that. So this is the fact of death, is that our lives matter. They matter more than we think we do, I think. And then there's our potential. So there's our potential, which is sort of represented here by the Buddha. So there's always more that we can become, depending on how we conduct our lives. That influence can be, it can be so much, because there's always more that we can become. So something else I want to talk about as well is how we do that. So I think this is the sort of the karma aspect of it, really. So how we do that, and how we conduct our lives, and something which I want to draw out which I think we haven't really talked about in the last few weeks. I've touched on it in previous talks, but I want to talk about commitment. So how we do that, how we realize our potential, actually is through committing. It's through committing, and what that means is actually really, really giving ourselves to what we're doing. It means continually turning up, making a commitment to what we're doing, and in that, something else can arise. So something beautiful can arise through that commitment. And this is what that dream actually means. So I'll tell you why. It's a slightly weird quirk that involves some 1990s comedy. But do people know the comedy program Big Train? Are people familiar with that? Big Train, yeah. It was a classic comedy in the 90s, which was incidentally around about the time I was a student. So I was a big fan of Big Train, and there was a sketch. Simon Pegg was in this sketch, so some of you will know who Simon Pegg is, and he's a baker. I won't go into too much detail. If I try and explain the whole sketch, it'll just be a bit boring. And I'll think it's really funny because I actually have seen it, and you'll just be sitting there going, "What's he talking about?" But anyway, there's this sketch where he's a baker, and through various things that he does, he's threatened with the sack. So he's a baker threatened with redundancy. And at a certain point, he just looks into the camera and he says, "Please, please don't fire me." He says, I'm committed to cakes." And I don't know why, that just really struck me in the 90s as quite a funny phrase. So I started saying this basically to people. I started saying to people, please don't, I'm committed to cakes. And then my partner and me have taken this on as a bit of a thing in our relationship, that it's like, actually, are you committed? Are you committed to this relationship? Yes, I'm committed. I'm committed to cakes. So if you're really committed, then you're committed to cakes. And it's quite funny, isn't it, what the mind does, what our brain does. So obviously, in my mind, I know that I'm going to give this talk, and I'm thinking about commitment. So I'm on this retreat in my dream, and I'm not committed, basically. I'm only there for the weekend. I'm not going to stay for the whole week, even though it's a week-long retreat. But then the cakes turn up, and I'm committed to cakes. So I really want to be there, basically. So that's what the dream means, and I think the reason why I sort of dreamt that is because, I think commitment it's something that we talk about a little bit here, but for me it's really, really key. So I think being committed and having a sense of commitment is it's absolutely crucial to sort of being on the path and staying on the path, basically. And not just that, but actually I think it's crucial to also as well, I want to put in some sort of like a qualification here as well, that I'm not just talking about Buddhist practice here. So this could mean this could mean other things as well. But as a committed Buddhist, obviously for me, my commitment to my practice and my commitment to doing what I'm doing and to being part of this Buddhist order, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about commitment. But commitment is absolutely central, I think. And one of the reasons why it's central is because our minds are quite fickle. So often we'll have an idea that we know in our heart of hearts that something is a good idea or something is beneficial for us, but we're not always in the mood for what's good for us, are we? So basically, sometimes we feel like it, sometimes we don't feel like it. And that's common to all of us, isn't it? We have this idea, we're very enthusiastic about it, but our feeling like it will come and go. That will wax and wane. So it's commitment that will see us through doing something whether we feel like it or not. Because if we live our lives when we only do the things that we feel like, and we only do it when we feel like it, then that's a very, very shallow and it's going to be a very, very unsatisfactory way to live your life. Maitreya Bandhu was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, where we were talking about pleasure, and we were talking about the importance of pleasure in whatever we do. We need to find pleasure in what we're doing, which is, I think, is another thing that the cakes represent in this dream. So we need to find pleasure, but pleasure won't get us very far on its own. It has quite a limited shelf life. So we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to kind of know our tendencies and know how we tend to be. And commitment will take care of that. So if we make a commitment, it means basically turning up whether we feel like it or not. It means doing the thing that we've promised we'll do, whether we feel like it or not. Whatever that thing is. And I think then looking forwards, it's interesting. I mentioned this a few times, but when I was a bit younger, so maybe 10 years ago now, I started doing a particular job in Tower Hamlets. It ended up being a sort of a national project, but I used to do this really, really lovely work, which was working with older people and doing discussion groups with them. So my job was to go into places like daycare centres and places where there's groups of older people and basically facilitate group discussions. And it was so lovely. It was such a beautiful thing to do because, well, it was a real privilege to talk to people and hear their life experience. And, often as younger people, we don't often get to hang out with people who are much older than us. We might spend time with our grandparents or something like that, but it's not common that we spend time with people who are a lot older than us. And I think that's a shame because it's a real opportunity when you hear old people talking about their lives. And when I used to do these groups, one of the things that I used to do was I used to get everybody to start off by answering a question. And the question was, when I look back on my life, the thing that I'm most proud of is. And then I used to ask them another question, which was, when I look back on my life, the thing that I regret is. And what do you think are some of the things that people regret when they look back on their life? What do you think that some of those things might be? Not enough cakes. I think that could be. Thanks. Okay. I'll give you the fiver later on. Actually, there was an old man on some advert, wasn't there, that did actually say that. I think it was a bit of a shock, wasn't it? Because obviously he's talking about sex. And this old man, he was about 95, he was on some advert. And they said, what do you regret about your life? And he said, frankly, I'd have liked to have had more sex. But actually, nobody ever said that to me, strangely enough. But so what do we think might be some of the things that people regretted? Or what do you think might be some of the things that people are proud of?
Not spending enough time with their parents.
With their
parents.
Yeah, their parents or their families. So that was a huge one. In fact, that was the biggest thing that people used to say. When they look back on their life, what they were most proud of was generally it was to do with their friendships or their family or their relationships. Interestingly, with men, they often used to talk about a period in their life. So they would talk about, well, I was proud of, for example, having served in the army or something like that. But then when you would dig a little deeper, what was always underneath that was something to do with relationships and friendships. And they would say, I never had friendships like that again in my life. So relationships and connection between human beings, that was really, really primary. What do you think are some of the things that people... Well, actually, I'll just answer this question. Rather than trying to be really facilitative. Let's turn this into a workshop. I'll tell you the things that people didn't regret. So nobody ever said... oh, I'm really proud of my career. I never heard that once. And I did this with literally, it's probably getting on for 1,000 people by the end of and it's across 7 years, 1,000, maybe even a couple of thousand. Nobody ever said, I'm really proud of my career. Nobody ever. Nobody ever said, I'm proud of my big house. Nobody ever said, I'm proud of all the money I've got in the bank. You would never hear any of those things. What people used to always express was a deep appreciation and gratitude for the deeper things in our life. So it was always relationships, human connection, or something to do with that. And then the other thing was, it would always be something to do with people having lived their lives according to particular values. So it would be things like, I remember this one person who was involved in the Salvation Army, and he was very, very proud of everything that he achieved as part of that, helping people, supporting people, helping people that were in a lot of distress. I remember somebody talking to me about their life as a Quaker and everything that sort of encompassed. I remember somebody talking to me about their life as an artist, and it was particular values that those people had, that they'd stayed true to, and that somehow had changed them and had had an effect on the world. So that's what it came down to. And it was very, very humbling to hear this. And it was also very humbling because you would often get people who had tremendous regrets about their life. So men in particular would often say that they'd spent too much time working and that they didn't take enough interest in their families. So it was very, very touching on the one hand and very humbling and very sad. And the interesting thing for me as well is that you could see this in people. So we become what we do. You know, this is a Buddhist teaching, but you could see it played out so very clearly in these situations. That the people who lived their life according to their values, you could see it in them. They look open, they look happy, they look fulfilled. And then you would see these people who hadn't done that, and it was almost like it had a physical effect on them. Often they would look shut down, there would be a slight sort of thing of frustration or anger sometimes. I remember when I was a kid, there was a man who lived in our hometown, and this man made a very, very strong impression on me. He was extremely angry, and he used to walk up and down the street shouting at people. And when I knew him, he was quite old. He was in his mid-70s by this point. And all those years of anger had just become etched on his face. I won't try and do an impression of him, because that could look a bit weird and would probably be a bit disrespectful. But it's like his face had taken on what he was through his life, really. And it was interesting listening to all these older people and talking about, well, they're getting close to the end of their life. And some of them look back and they feel a tremendous sense of satisfaction, and others feel a tremendous sense of regret. So with those people who had really committed to their lives, or let me put it another way, with those people that had led very fulfilling lives, whether they felt like it or not had very little to do with it. So there would be periods where they were enjoying doing that, where it came very easily to them, and other times where that's really not the case at all. But the point was people who had committed to something and they'd seen it through, and they just kept doing it whether they felt like it or not. I remember this one woman talking to me about that she was a very little girl sort of during the war, and she'd been helped by this group of people. I can't remember what it was, some local organisation. She'd been helped by this group of people because her family had been bombed out during the war, and she'd been made homeless as a child, and she was sleeping in the docks in Wapping for a few days before she was found by these people. and they took her in and gave her a home, and she said she was so inspired by their kindness that she decided that that's what she wanted to do with her life, was to help other people. I found that tremendously moving. And for those people who were doing that, they're going into these tremendously difficult situations, and they're in the middle of a war, and yet still they continue to do what they were doing. So just a couple of other things that I want to say about commitment are the reason why we need to commit to something is because times will get difficult. So I'll just talk about this from a point of view of Buddhist practice. Times will get difficult. There'll be times when you feel like you don't know what you're doing. You don't feel particularly inspired. Your meditation practice seems to have dried up. Maybe this won't be the case for you, but it has for me over the years. So I've been doing this now for 20 years, something like that, a bit more than 20 years. And there are periods where you don't feel particularly inspired, and it's going to be true of anything that you commit to. There's going to be times where you feel very inspired, you feel full of faith, you feel full of shraddha, and then times when you don't. And there are definite things that you can do to nurture that and to keep it alive, but still, even then, there are going to be difficult times. But then, conversely, the reason why we need to commit is because times are going to be good as well. And actually, I think there's as much danger, if there's no commitment, there's as much danger in things going extraordinarily well as there are things going badly, or your inspiration drying up. So I've seen it time and time again here at the Buddhist Center, because I've been coming here for a long time, is people come along in a bad state. They are struggling with something, they're stressed, they're anxious, they come along, they learn to meditate, and things start to change, because meditation can make your mind much more positive, much more expansive, so things start to change, and pretty soon people are feeling fantastic, so then they decide they don't need to meditate anymore, and maybe it's not quite as simple and straightforward as that. But this happens time and time again. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's great if people come along and they're having a very bad time and they come along and it helps. I'm all for that. But I also think that, it's a bit like settling for a mini muffin when I'm just staying with the cake theme here, because this seems to be working for people. It's like we've got this sort of mini muffin, and it's really, really nice, but we don't have any idea of the amazingness of some of the cakes that are made in the world. I'm being slightly flippant, but I think actually being a functioning, happy, healthy human being is fantastic, and that's really something to aim for. But actually, if we really commit ourselves, what we can achieve through or what we can become through practice is so much more than that. In fact, it's so much more than that we can't really see it from where we are. We've been talking a bit about this over the last few weeks. So this is represented by this statue of the Buddha here. But there is so much more than we can be than just happy and healthy and, with a little bit of enjoyment in our life. There's so much more that we can be than that. And we almost can't, we can't imagine it because we have a limited consciousness. So we can't imagine what that looks like now. But at the same time, it's interesting. I was talking with someone about this the other day. I think also what happens is sometimes it's slightly problematical the way we talk about Buddhism and the metaphors that we use. And one of the metaphors that we use is the path, and we talk about the journey. And I think that is helpful in some ways. And in other ways, I think it's not helpful. And one of the ways I think it's not helpful is that what we tend to think is, okay, here's the start, and this is the end point, enlightenment. And what we've got is step, 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 same, enlightenment, wow, bang, boom, shanka. And it's not like that either. We change over the years, and actually if we keep going, we change more and more and more. And certainly my own experience has been that I've become somebody that I could never have imagined becoming, when I started 20 years ago. Okay. So we need to find something to commit to. And I think that thing needs to be worthy of us, and it needs to contain deeper human values. So I was talking about these people that I've worked with, and something in what they were saying sort of touched on something more deeper, almost sort of transcendent, really, that what can happen when we live our lives in a committed and meaningful way. But I think we also, one of the things that I found helpful in my life is that I commit from what I call my best self. So one of the best bits of advice I ever got was make your commitments when you're feeling inspired. So this was something that somebody said to us on our ordination course, which I'm going to say a bit more about in a moment. But if you want to know when to commit or what to commit to, commit when you're feeling inspired. That's the way to do it. You can't commit when you're feeling run down and low on energy, because there's no sense of possibility then. But if you commit when you're feeling inspired, chances are, when it comes round to it, you're going to be doing this, whatever it is, and you're going to be seeing through that commitment when you're not feeling particularly inspired. But that doesn't matter, because you've already made the right choice, basically. You've committed from a place of feeling sort of open and generous and, whatever it is. And in a sense, if you commit then at that point, then it's a way of fastening yourself to those higher values, I think. It's a way of aligning yourself with those higher values. So we need to find something to commit to. It needs to contain something that is worthy of us and our potential. Commit from your best self. And then also, I think, another thing that's important to think about is, if you're thinking about committing to something or doing something and you're not sure, look at people who've been doing that thing for a long time and see what you think of them. So this is very much the way that I approach things. Not necessarily, it's not necessarily as black and white as this, but I've basically committed to the path that I've committed to because I look at people like Maitreya Bandhu, Jnanavacha, who some of you will know, and I just think, well, they're doing it, and those are the kind of people that I want to become like. And I've done other things in my life where, so for example, I was very much involved in the world of music and composition for a long time. And I remember I did a master's in music composition many years ago. And I remember looking at the people that were running that course and thinking, it was sort of weird really. I had this moment where I realised that if you do something, it doesn't necessarily transform the whole of you. So it can do, but there was one person in particular that I had quite a lot to do with on this course, and he was tremendously knowledgeable about musical algorithms, but wasn't a particularly pleasant person to be around. So I think have a look at the people that have been doing the thing that you're thinking of committing to and see what effect that it has. Decide who you want to become, find the sort of people that you want to become, and see what they're doing. So when I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about reflections on commitment, and it put me in mind of of a period in my life, which was 5 years ago, because it was during the time of my ordination, and I was on my ordination retreat. So in our order, you ask to be ordained, you go through a training period, and then if you're invited for ordination, you're invited to join the order. That usually happens within the context of a 4-month retreat. And you're ordained it used to be you're ordained in the middle of the retreat when I was ordained. It's not like that now, but it used to be ordained in the middle of the retreat. So you have a private ordination and a public ordination. And I just had my private ordination. So it was myself and Yanavacha. And it was the most beautiful experience. It was just incredible. Just going into this small space and being given my new name and reciting the refuges and precepts, and that basically marking my ordination. And there was a few of us living together during this time. So for 2 weeks we lived there was 18 of us on the retreat, but for 2 weeks during the period when people were being ordained, there was a kind of we split into smaller communities. And there was myself and Maitreya Bandhu and Yanavacha and 2 other people living as a small community. And it was just such a beautiful experience. And I think the reason why was, and I spoke a bit about this at the time, was that I'd been looking my whole life for something that I could commit to, and I didn't quite know what that was. I didn't quite know what it looked like. And then through becoming involved, first of all in Liverpool, in a Tree Ratna centre there, and then here, I sort of finally thought, okay, this is something that I can commit to. And my ordination was me firmly making that commitment, making a lifelong commitment to do this for the rest of my life. And there was both a tremendous sense of joy and a tremendous sense of relief having made that commitment. And I remember saying at the time, it was almost like I just sort of put a stake in the ground, basically. That though I knew that, it didn't mean that I didn't ever have to make any choices for the rest of my life, but it was almost like this one sort of big commitment would take care of whatever the smaller things, whatever the smaller choices were that I was going to be making in my life. So I'd made that big commitment. And what the effect that had was that it permeated my mind with a sense of joy, which really wasn't easily shifted. So we were just doing very simple things like eating together, meditating together, all of those sorts of things. But I just felt this tremendous sense of joy and tremendous sense of happiness. I remember going to sleep at night, and it's in a retreat centre in Spain, this place, and I was sleeping in a tent, and I remember zipping up the tent very thoroughly because there were lots of snakes in that part of the world, and thinking, okay, not good if snakes get into my tent in the night, but just zipping up my tent at night and just going to sleep, listening to the sounds of the birds and whatever else it was that was going on outside, and just feeling this tremendous sense of joy and tremendous sense of sort of satisfaction that I'd nailed my colours to the flag. It's a terribly mundane phrase, but I'd basically put my money where my mouth is. That I'd made this commitment, and it was a commitment that I was happy to make. And then it was interesting, just a few weeks ago, so that was 5 years ago, and then just a few weeks ago, I was on a little reunion retreat in Sweden with 8 of the men that I was ordained with. And that was really, really lovely as well. And it was interesting, I think what was so lovely about it is that just by being there, just by turning up, we were living out that commitment, basically. We were all aware that we'd made this commitment, we'd stayed involved for the last 5 years, and we were each of us living out that commitment in different ways. And then just the act of being together was really, really lovely for that reason. So I think often the reason why we can feel unfulfilled, or the reason why people feel unfulfilled, and this goes back to what I was saying before about talking with older people, is because people haven't found something worth committing to, they haven't committed to it, and they haven't started to live out that commitment. So I think if we can find something worth committing to, we commit to it, and we can live it out. I think it sounds simple, but I think that is the key. And I think this very much relates to what we've been talking about over the last few weeks, because in a sense what we've been discussing is, okay, well, the fact of death is there, what we do matters, so what are we going to do with our lives? And I think what we need to do with our lives is find something, commit to it, and then live out that commitment. So that's the death and karma aspect. And then wisdom is what arises when we do that. So every time we take the next step, every time we continue to live out whatever commitment it is that we've made, over time wisdom starts to arise. So at first it starts to seep in, and then sometimes we get flashes, and then slowly, over time, what happens is we become that wisdom more and more through the commitment that we've made. So I think just to carry on this theme as well, I think when I'm talking about commitment, it can sound like the grand thing. And I think that is true, but I think also as well, commitment is about deciding what it is that you want to commit to and then always taking the next step. And there is always a next step. So it's interesting, I remember when I first started coming along to the Buddhist Centre in Liverpool, and I used to look at these people with these things around their neck, white cases with the funny names. And I used to think that somehow they were slightly different from me, that I would never do that, basically. I'm not the sort of person that does that, basically. So I heard about these people called mitras, and I knew that that's something that I would never do. I'd never make that kind of commitment. I'd certainly never ask for ordination or join the order. So I'm not sure what's happened. Actually, I do know what's happened, and that is that I've just kept doing it, basically. I've just kept doing it. I've just kept taking the next step. I just kept getting up in the morning and meditating. I've kept going on retreat. And then for me, that then got to a point where I thought, okay, well, I think that for me, the way to deepen that commitment is to practice as deeply as I can and to share that with others. And I wanted to do that within the context of joining our order. So that's all I've ever done. And it's interesting, I was talking to my Chair Bandhu about this as well a few days ago, and he was saying that's all he's ever done as well, is just keep taking the next step. Just keep taking the next step, basically. Okay, so maybe I'll finish there. But what I'd like us to do is, I'd just like us to get into pairs just before we end the evening. And I'd like you to think about what could be something that you could commit to doing that will deepen your life. So it may be something to do with coming here. So for example, 3 things that you could do are commit to a regular meditation practice, like 5 days a week or something like that. You could commit to going on retreat. If you've been on retreat, you could commit to going on a longer retreat. Or you could commit to coming to a regular class here. Or it could be something that's personal to you. It could be something completely different. But I'd like us to just get into pairs and for a few minutes just discuss with your other person, what commitment would take your life a bit deeper? What could you commit to? And then make that commitment. So what are you going to do? Make that commitment to each other. So let's do that for a few minutes.